Today's guest, Oliver Manojlovic, VP Sales from Personio.
If they have no reason to do all of these things that they need to do, then they won't do them. That's a very fundamental element. And regardless of your salary, you can't inject them. So one of my most important questions in the interview process is, what is motivating you? Why are you getting up in the morning? Or if this wouldn't be there, would you stay in bed? Because people then often say, oh, I want to make the customer happy. That's good. That's on a certain level, a good motivation, but that's not the core motivation why people get up. So if you couldn't make the customer happy, you would stay in bed and not get up. No. Okay. So I'll try to dig around that. So motivation is one piece. The other piece is the ability to learn fast. The third piece is coachability. You need to be able to learn through others, because if you're not coachable, if you're defensive on feedback from others, you have a disadvantage. Then these are things that you probably have to a certain extent, but can develop further, is tenacity and grit. So when things get hard, you still need to keep going. There's always a saying, the difference between successful and unsuccessful people is simply that the successful person got up once more after they fell down. And in sales, that's 100% true. And then there's an element of, you need to be dedicated to do what's necessary. And when I mean what's necessary, obviously in moral and ethical boundaries, you shouldn't do stupid things. But when the month or the quarter is closing, and I had negotiations with CEOs until up to, 11:59 p.m. And we got the contract in at 11:59 p.m. on the last day. So if you turn off your notebook at 6, 7 o'clock and say, okay, let's call it a day, I tried everything to get in, then actually you're missing a couple of hours. And, when you're in an environment like us, you need to compress time as much as possible. So if you don't go those steps, you'll lose. So that's a very important thing.
Oliver and I met in Munich 4 years ago at the Salesforce Munich office, when he just started recently at Personio and introduced or rolled out Salesforce. And we talked a lot about his background, how he got into sales, and also the difference of sales in Europe versus in the US, because he also has a very strong background in enterprise sales of companies like GitHub and New Relic. And at some point he moved to Personio and then scaled them from 500 to more than 10,000 customers as a VP sales. How he went through different phases of expansion, restructuring teams, hiring, learnings, and also how he differentiates high performers for maybe regular or average performers, and also his recent time as an angel investor in the HR tech space, and in generally about certain learnings of his career. So check it out and have fun.
Then you can build trust, and then you can spend less time communicating and more time just getting shit done.
Then I went home and thought about this sentence.
We basically put it on the table.
Hiring takes time. People are trained.
How to objectively judge certain situations.
It's very, 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 very hard to change things.
That was the learning.
Entrepreneurs with empathy.
To the people side.
Good morning, Oliver.
Good morning, Thomas. How are you doing?
I'm fine. I just had a morning walk and looked forward to our podcast.
Oh, that's good. That's a good start into the day. Very nice.
Yes. And it's a long time when we met last time. I think it was 4 or 5 years ago in Munich at the Salesforce office, where Personio was still small. And I think I also discovered firsthand what Salesforce can do, because we tried to hire some Salesforce engineers for a software company, and then I wanted to understand the field better. And this is where we sat next to each other, I guess.
Yes, I think it's 4 years, or hang on. No, it is 4 years ago, because we implemented Salesforce about 4 years ago. And that must have been around that time.
Yeah, nice. And do you still have it?
Yeah. Fortunately and unfortunately. Salesforce like, I don't mean to be, how to say, disrespectful of what they've achieved as a company. I think they've, like, as they like also call their group, they're trailblazers in this SaaS world, and they're a role model for many companies, for many startups, and I think they've achieved tremendous things. But also, like from a pure user perspective, sometimes I would wish for something a little bit more modern, because the world has changed since then, and they have changed too. But maybe they should evolve at a quicker or higher rate.
Yeah, I totally understand. So maybe before jumping into some topics, could you give us a bit more context about your background and what shaped you most?
Yeah, happy to do so. I mean, in German, sometimes you would call people old rabbits or old dogs. So I'm already for a while in this whole game, and but I probably need to start with a few like, let's say, pointers even earlier before I went into SaaS, because when people ask me what do I do, then I say typically I'm a seller or I'm in sales, because still in Germany sales is a little bit of a no-go area. When people go to university, there's no sales study. There's no education in that direction. There's only one university in Germany, which is Bochum, who has a master in sales management. All others are focusing on marketing or product or engineering, which is also very important. But I feel like there's a lack in sales, and it's represented in our overall society. And therefore, I try to be very, very simple and pointy on that. Because I started selling quite early. I mean, my parents had a restaurant, and I was brought up there. And when you work in such a little restaurant, which I also had to do as a teenager, then obviously you learn to interact with customers, with clients. You already kind of like get a very early education into sales, because you obviously, they ask them, hey, would you something recommend? What's a good dish today? And then you're like, okay, what do we have today? And I think that's a starting point. And then my first, actually, like, outside of my family business, professional sales job was selling American Express credit cards at the airport in Frankfurt. So that's a I would say it's a very controversial job. I think people, perceive those people who are doing this as very, very annoying, when they approach them on the airport. But I think most people don't understand how many people actually, I don't know how it's now, but like when I did it, how long is it ago? Like 20 years. 20 years ago when I did it, how many people actually like stop and subscribe for a credit card? So, and you could make good commissions with that. So that was, for me, a very fascinating thing. I was always triggered by, hey, if I do a lot, if I perform well, if I deliver results, I get more than someone who doesn't perform well, who doesn't deliver results, and so on. So I think that's been a driver through my upbringing, very much. And then I had different ways also during my university. I'm in Germany Bankkaufmann, like I have a vocal apprenticeship in banking. And then post that, I went to studies. I didn't finish my studies because I was simply always distracted with working projects, like doing sales jobs here, doing business development there. And then I said, okay, look, this is pointless. Like, either you cut down all the side projects or you stop studying and go full-time working. And I took the latter and ended up in a software company a little bit by accident. I had two offers, one from a very well-known German company, but in a more boring field, security for logistics. Sorry, maybe not boring field, but a field that didn't excite me so much. I think in itself, there's a lot of interesting things. And when we look what happened with e-commerce, probably also a very interesting sector. But it to me appeared less exciting than software, which I felt like is the future. And then I decided for the software job. And I think one thing that's relevant to that is the software job at the time was paid worse than the job at this big German corporation. So I accepted an offer that had 15% less in cash and didn't include a company car. And when you're like mid-20s, you're like, oh, company car. Oh, my God. Yes, I made it. But obviously, that's just part of it. And I wanted to be in a more dynamic, more exciting environment. And now I'm 16, 17 years in this software cloud SaaS business with different stages. The first company I worked for was Borland, and then a few others. And before I joined Personio, I worked for companies like GitHub and New Relic, which some people might know as well.
Yes.
Relatively prominent scale-ups from the US. But I also
And
worked
also, I think very strong in enterprise sales, right? Because otherwise you cannot sell in Europe as a US company if you don't nail sales, B2B sales.
So you mean the companies were in enterprise sales yeah. I mean, how to put it? I think there's two sides to it. The US companies have a stronger sales culture based on their society and how their society works. So when you say to someone in the US, I'm in sales, people are mostly pretty appreciative in comparison or in contrast to what you have here in Europe. And then the other piece is when it comes down to technology, there are a couple years, maybe even a couple decades ahead of many things that are happening in Europe. I mean, we're playing catch up in some areas. But for a while, you didn't have B2B SaaS companies coming out of Germany or even Europe. That was something that only came from the US. So if you wanted to be in that field, the only option was to work for a US company. And with that, only US companies would offer such products. So yes, there were challenges selling in Europe, but I would say sometimes there were no alternatives. And unfortunately, I never worked for a company where there was no alternative to our product. That would have been easy. But I think that was also part of the upbringing. So the first company I worked for was in decline, had an average product at a premium price point. So that was really selling. You couldn't just collect the orders at the fax machine, as we would say. You actively had to, work with the customer and convince them that you would bring the most value over a competitor.
What frameworks did you use back then? Was it maybe 10, 15 years ago? Because I think there was no challenger sale or spin model established or something like this.
I think solution sales was popular at the time. I think spin was definitely around. Challenger, I'm not sure if it was already popular, but I think it must have been around the block somewhere as well, at least more in the US. I mean, not many things made it to Europe. But also, like, when I started at this first company, like, the process was, okay, the solution engineers would explain you the product, which was really nice because then, you could go into conversations and really understand it deeply. But it was not like a programmatic approach. It was more like, okay, this guy is good in this product, this guy is good in this product, and so on. So therefore, each will spend with you 1 or 2 hours, and then there you go. We had sometimes a bit more, like, I don't know, when we had kickoffs or something like that, a bit more enablement, but it was not super kind of like structured or focused. It was more like generalistic. But the approach was, okay, Ollie, look, you're now in inside sales. So there was no SDRs at the time. So I was like an SDR, but could close my customers that I would prospect. And we had Salesforce as well. And basically my boss told me every account that is not associated to another account executive is yours. And that was literally like giving me the yellow pages and saying, okay, look, find your business. And then I had to call and prospect and try to figure out how to approach those people. So
no LinkedIn yet, where you could find prospects more easily or with more information?
15 years ago, I think the German LinkedIn population was very small. Even Xing was underutilized. And yeah, no things like that. I mean, I still argue that LinkedIn is not a main source of business, but maybe a flank, like an adjacent source of business, because many companies, if you're not selling just to startups and modern companies or enterprises, if you're selling to very traditional companies, many of them don't have LinkedIn, or at least they're not as present as, typically sellers or recruiters or, the people who are trying to make a living on that.
Yes, I agree. And how did you then end up at Personio? What's the backstory behind it?
I don't think it's super kind of like crazy or something like that. But after I think like 5-6 years working for US companies, I started to think about, why is there no German or European B2B business that wants to conquer the world? Because that was around the time when Zalando, Delivery Hero, and so on became bigger, and with that more visible and prominent. And but there was no B2B. So like, I couldn't go to Zalando and say, hey, I want to now sell fashion just because I like the fact that you're coming out of Germany. I wouldn't have any, like value add for Zalando, or at least that's what I thought. And then I looked around and saw a few startups, talked to a few throughout a few years. Some were interesting, but none of them really convinced me. And then at some point in time, I got connected or contacted by a headhunter, talking to me about Personio. And I took a look at it and that, interesting. They really have a fresh approach. Like, the website was just reworked, like, I think just a couple of weeks beforehand. If I would seen the old website, I probably wouldn't have been excited about it. So, that's like, there's those details, like, that catch you. It's not just this one big thing. And then I came back to the recruiter and said, hey, it would be interesting to have a call with them. And then they somehow kind of like waited a couple of days. I didn't hear back from them. And then I wrote them again and I'm like, hey, listen, I really want to have a call with them. And then things were set in motion, and the rest is a little bit history. I got to know Hanno, the other founders, the other management team, some of the investors. And we went through a thorough interview process where, I assessed them and they assessed me. And then we figured it could work out.
In case you like my show, please subscribe. I would really appreciate it. Was Martina already there at that time?
I know she joined actually the same month with me. We joined April 2018.
Okay, and what was the environment? It was around then 50 people?
I don't have the exact number. 50, 60, 70 could be around that. So.
And what were the revenue numbers? Can you share rough numbers?
We had 500 customers at the time. Let's put it this way. So don't know exactly what the revenue was. And I'm not sure, like, we don't talk publicly revenue numbers, but we had 500 customers.
And now, how many customers do you have now?
10,000.
Okay, let's go a bit through that journey on how the sales org developed over time in stages to go from 500 to more than 10,000 customers.
Yeah, happy to do so.
How did you start?
I think I just started. Let's put it this way. So I came in and Hanno told me, okay, look, we're mostly inbound driven. We want to add outbound and potentially partnerships at some point in time to kind of like generate business, generate pipeline and things like that. And we knew already that we would have to grow the team significantly. I don't think I would have anticipated. I mean, now my team that is only focused on Germany, Austria, Switzerland is 180 people just doing new business sales. So that's not even including the people who are taking care of existing customers. There's another team on top of that. And at the time when I joined, it was 7 or 8 people. So significant growth. And I didn't know that we would have to go there, but I knew we have to go to, 30, 40, 50 people for sure. And as I've been in other companies and also in leading positions where I had to hire teams, I knew about the challenges that bringing in people, hiring people is really, really difficult, because sellers, especially the ones who are a bit more experienced, they're typically really good at selling themselves. And some of them are really good at selling everything else on top of that. But some of them are really just good at selling themselves. And I felt like a big key to that is motivation. So why do people want to do something? And there's a little, I don't want to say it's a given. I think people who are more tenured can also be very hungry and driven. But it tends to be that people, as they progress through their career, as they had some achievements, they get less hungry, they get less driven, they get less motivated to really do the necessary things. So my mind shifted very quickly for many reasons, like, okay, we need to build a team out of young people that we hire from university, or people that come from, we hired recruiters, for example, to become account executives. because they knew the space, HR, they knew how to sell. Recruiting in essence is nothing else. And we even hired a guy who sold duplex carports beforehand. I mean, not that this is kind of like outrageously funny, but he was an outrageously funny person. He's now a founder himself. So he went through our sales school and now moved on into starting his own business. And I love those stories, like I love when, something happens and throughout a few years, you see how people transform. So, and that was the intent. So we wanted to hire people, educate them around sales, teach them everything that we think is important, especially when it comes down to prospecting, generating outbound cold pipeline. That's a skill where many people are not good at, still doing sales because they never got a good education around it. And they never got really used to it because it's very unpleasant. Doing outbound prospecting, cold calling, don't get me wrong, like it's not like the worst thing you can think of, but it's hard. It can be sometimes super, super tough, especially mentally. And you need to have an environment that kind of like supports people doing it.
How does this environment look like for outbound that you can really support each other?
Yeah. I mean, it's at a core, it's the team itself. So you need to have a group of people who have a mutual mission, and you need to mix that team with rookies and more senior people. So because if you just have rookies or if you just have seniors, it gets imbalanced. If you have a more mixed set of tenures, there will be people who have seen the struggles that others are just going through right now, and they can help them. And especially, when everything went into lockdown during COVID, that was a very, very challenging time for us and for those people who are doing that, because some of them were just, like graduates, and in Munich, cost of living is relatively high. So they would sit in a 1-bedroom apartment, not even in a communal apartment, but like really like a student apartment where kitchen, living room, bathroom is literally like in one room. And out of there, they have to do cold calling into people who are currently as well completely like crazy in terms of like, oh, the world is turning upside down. We don't know how to survive. And now you want to sell me software? Yeah, that's my job. I mean, and by the way, this software can actually help you to go through that time that you're just passing through. So that's the reason why we feel like it's very relevant that we talk. But obviously, not all of those conversations were very constructive. And as people were then isolated, they didn't have the support system, the support group that they would have before. And that was, for example, the first team that we brought back to the office, or allowed in smaller groups to come back to the office, so that it's in a, let's say, controlled, contained environment.
And how does a prospecting job look like at Personio?
It's depending on where you are, but when you start as an SDR, you have, many people have then the goal to become an AE, which is very like fair. It's kind of like part of that whole journey, the career outlook. Not like there's very few people who want to stay, like make an entire career being an IC as an SDR, but I've seen people like that as well. So there's nothing wrong with it. It's just a matter of preference, because some people enjoy it more, others less. So you start typically with smaller customers. You get training. We have probably a month of onboarding where we don't expect a lot of, like results from your side, but where we invest in product enablement, process enablement, sales enablement, different things. And then like we bring you to the outside world and allow you to do your first learnings, because that's the most important thing. You have to do and experience what you're doing. I always, some people say sales is science, sales is art. I think it's both. I think it's craft. It's like building a table. So people can teach you how to build a table. So technically it might be perfect, but whether it's, like beautiful and whether it's durable or, like inspiring, that's up to you. So there's a scientific part and there's a artistical part, and therefore, there's no kind of like dark magic around it. Everything is actually pretty clear, structurable and articulable, and you can bring it together. And that's what we're trying to bring to the group. But the most important piece when you go into sales, you have to embrace failure, because you have to develop a resilient mindset. And the only way how you can develop a resilient mindset is if you fail often. And that's one thing. That's also what I say in interviews. You will fail more than you win. That's the nature of sales. That's like, I don't know any salesperson, or especially not any good salesperson, who throughout their career has won more than they lost in terms of like deals. Obviously, they probably made their numbers, they probably made their targets, they overachieved and so on. They made a good living, but that doesn't mean that they didn't lose. Actually, they lost quite a lot to get to that point where they are. And that's kind of like the entry where you go. And then there's different things, different, like on which sector or which segment you work. There might be more a transactional element, or you're a little bit more deeper into accounts. So it's really dependent on where you then end up, like let's say your first 6 months.
So you're structured by function, and the functions are then again structured by region and by industry and by company size or customer target size?
Very, very broadly said, yes. We don't do so much industries. We have, for example, like a public sector team or a public/non-profit sector team. That's how much we go into sectors. The rest is just private companies, and then by size and by region.
Totally makes sense. And when was the time where you need to expand the sales force out of Germany, the home market?
I mean, we were always active in Austria and Switzerland from the get-go because of the language, proximity. And then in 2019, we started to internationalize, to move into other markets. We also acquired a company in Spain. So that was kind of like a natural expansion logic, because we had then a team there. We could become more like a local player and so on. And then we took markets like the UK, the Nordics, Benelux on top of it, a bit more in sequence, not everything at once. But we're still in the process of it. So Germany is still our most dominant market. And then depending on where you go and how much we've invested, then there's a kind of like a tiering, you could say.
And how did you structure the sales org when you expanded the sales force?
Yeah. I mean, I was not responsible for that international expansion. So kind of we took the decision that I remain responsible for Germany, Austria, Switzerland, because that was our, like bread and butter, if you would say so. And Hanno was very careful about, now pulling me into other areas. We hired a head of international who then kind of like was my peer to start that international expansion. And then I think about 6-9 months into that, we hired Geraldine, our chief revenue officer, who then kind of like took the whole go-to-market motion and supported us in the elements where we would, go international and have our domestic market. But we took like a regionalized approach. So we basically had Southern Europe, which would consolidate a couple of countries like Spain, France, Italy, and so on, Portugal, in one broader region. And then we had Northern Europe, which was UK, Benelux, and the Nordics at the time. By now, this is a little bit reshuffled, changed, but overall, the approach is still the same.
And now with the acquisitions going on, do you also have different teams focusing on different products to sell or different modules of your product? Because I think it also really got quite big, the Personio suite, when we call it like that.
Yeah. Interestingly, no. So we have yes and no. When you are a new business seller, you still sell everything, because at the core is always there. So we don't sell, for example, just recruiting. I mean, there's like some rare cases where customers start with that and then move on in adding the core HR piece as well. But as the core is like critical to everything else, you can't go without the core normally. And then on top, customers decide, okay, what else do I want? And obviously not every customer opts in for everything. And it's also a little bit different. Like, are we selling to small customers or are we selling to larger customers? We have a segment of 10 to 2,000 employees, and the buying process between, let's say, a 30 people company and a 300 and then a 1,500 company is like very, very different. So that said, we obviously try to excite the customer about the full suite and try to, see whether this would drive the most value for them. If we come to the conclusion that, they pick a different approach, they want to take it more step by step, then we start step by step. If they say we want to do everything at once, let's do everything at once. So we're a little bit guided by the customer. We don't try to kind of like oversell and push things into it, because that leads mostly to disappointment. Sure, sometimes customers buy a little bit in advance because they know that they're growing fast or something like that. But if they tell me, yeah, we don't need recruiting, I don't need to sell them recruiting. Then let's start with the core. And if in a year from now they also want to have the recruiting module, it comes on top. And by now we have a new product that we launched a couple of weeks ago, Personio Payroll. Which is our own payroll. And that's where we are, where we for the first time deployed a specialist sales team, because payroll is actually kind of like our product is big and then payroll on top is big. So it's a huge product in itself. And we want to make sure these are less typical sellers. These are more like product experts in the sales process who support then the existing teams, whether it's new business or our existing business salespeople, to make sure that when we have more complicated questions, that they're taken really, really well care of, because payroll is a very sensitive topic and you have to get it right. If it doesn't work, it's very binary. Either it works or it doesn't. So
yes. And is it for white collar workers or for blue collar workers or all?
So in Germany, for those who know that field a little bit, there's a company called ITSG. ITSG is a joint venture of the social security vendors, or like the Krankenkassen, Arbeitslosenversicherung, and so on. So they basically operate two things. A portal called SVNet. So, when your tax advisor does payroll for, a company with 5 people, then they enter it manually there and then it gets processed. But if the tax advisor does payroll for many, or your payroll provider does payroll for many, then they utilize the API from ITSG. But in order to utilize the API from ITSG, you need to become certified. So they are validating the quality of your product. And with that, they have certain packages, as they call it. So typically when you start that, you certify for the core package, which entails, I think, 80% of the German payroll use cases. But that's mostly salaries. That's less wages, which are more than common in blue collar areas. So therefore, the answer is I wouldn't hardly distinguish between blue and white collar. I would distinguish between wages and salaries. So we are mostly then focused for the beginning on salaries. We can do some wages if they're simple. But for example, if there's, let's say, complicated Tarifverträge, I'm not sure if tariffs is the right transition. I think so. But basically, those union contracts or something like that, we couldn't serve.
Nice, because I'm super curious about that field, because I'm currently doing an angel investment in a payroll solution starting in Germany and focusing on the wages side. So maybe at some point we can get acquired from Personio.
Let's see. I might even know who you're talking about. But
you're also an angel investor, right? So you're doing it also with Picus together, I saw.
Yeah, I've now I've been active for about 2.5 years as an angel. Picus is one of the VC firms that I'm collaborating a little bit more closely, because obviously they've been early on investors in Personio. And then when I decided I want to do that, they've been very supportive. And so we support each other on deals. Sometimes they ask me for opinion or for support of their portfolio companies or something like that. And then other situations, they bring me on board with deals or something like this. So so I would say I have 2-3 VCs that I work relatively closely with.
And what's your focus as an angel investor? Do you have one?
Pretty much what I know, a B2B SaaS product. So very boring.
In case you have any feedback or anything you want to share with me, please send me an email on thomas@peoplewise.com or hit me up on LinkedIn. And in case you really enjoy the show, please subscribe. I would really appreciate it. Do you already have some companies you can talk about?
That I've invested in?
Yes.
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, there's an interesting HR tool that I invested in last year called Empion, which is like a talent acquisition, talent matching tool based on machine learning algorithm. I struggle to use the word AI. Probably it would be good for promoting them, but everything is AI at the moment, and they've done that or started that before that whole shit popped up in this broader fashion. They're doing really interesting things. I've invested already a while ago in a company called Sastrify that are doing procurements, for SaaS, or what else is there around? I've made like 17 or 18 investments. There's also a company called Recommendi there, kind of like a technology vendor for smaller e-commerce shops to bring their shop capabilities onto the Amazon marketplace capabilities without having to go onto the marketplace, because I think Amazon is for many people a very important source, but it's also very risky if you only sell over Amazon, because then once something happens that is not supposed to happen, then you lose your primary revenue stream, and so on. And there's a few more. So probably it's unfair if I now just pick and choose, but there's a couple, and from a scope, it's mostly B2B SaaS. But I'm not focused on sales tools. Probably I'm one of the most skeptical persons when it comes down to SaaS sales tools, because that's my daily doing, and I know where the shortfalls are. And in other areas, maybe I'm positively naive enough to overlook those shortfalls.
Yeah, that's maybe good. That's maybe good for change. And when we just look back again for the transformation of 500 to more than 10,000 customers at Personio, in terms of hiring, what was your transformational or learning journey there? Because I think you hired many reps and many managers below your scope.
I think for us, the fundamental element was that we decided that we want to go this junior education route, because that allowed us to hire more people without experience. If we would have started now to compete with big scale-ups and so on, other larger tech companies, we would have had a really difficult time, hiring those people at the right quantities at the right price point. So obviously hiring juniors comes with, lower salaries, but you need to invest. And we felt more comfortable around that because we then knew how those people would be educated. What are we getting after 2, 3, 4 years? How will the team look like then when we continue with that journey? And a talent acquisition team, including employer branding, including campus recruiting, and so on. You all had to have these things in place, because if you don't have a function that supports you properly there, as a hiring manager, you can't hire a couple hundred people without that support.
Exactly. And you cannot just hire all the time. You also need to manage, right? You also need to make sure that you hit the targets and so on.
Correct. You need to deliver results. Let's put it this way. I'm sure managing is part of the game. Leading is part of the game. But I think the biggest job of a first-line manager in sales is actually training his or her team, because that's the main focus. How do you make your team successful? And that kind of cascades more even further higher up the chain, just with then different exercises. So I don't need to teach my direct reports on cold calling or something like that, but I need to teach them on how to build a business case if they think investment in a certain area is important and would accelerate our growth, or things like that. So how to then operate a team at a different level.
And when you look at also back at all the seller you led, what are the attributes of the really outstanding performers? Is there a pattern even?
Yeah, I think there's definitely some. I'm not sure if I would call it a pattern, because there's a couple traits that are very important. And I'll try to be as comprehensive as possible. I'm sure I'll miss a few, but first of all, people need to be motivated. So if they have no reason to do all of these things that they need to do, then they won't do them. That's a very fundamental element. And regardless of your salary, you can't inject them. So one of my most important questions in the interview process is, what is motivating you? Why are you getting up in the morning? Or if this wouldn't be there, would you stay in bed? Because people then often say, oh, I want to make the customer happy. That's good. That's on a certain level, a good motivation, but that's not the core motivation why people get up. So if you couldn't make the customer happy, you would stay in bed and not get up. No. Okay. So I'll try to dig around that. So motivation is one piece. The other piece is the ability to learn fast. The third piece is coachability. You need to be able to learn through others, because if you're not coachable, if you're defensive on feedback from others, you have a disadvantage. And these are things that you probably have to a certain extent, but can develop further, is tenacity and grit. So when things get hard, you still need to keep going. There's always a saying, the difference between successful and unsuccessful people is simply that the successful person got up once more after they fell down. And in sales, that's 100% true. And then there's an element of, you need to be dedicated to do what's necessary. And when I mean what's necessary, obviously in moral and ethical boundaries, you shouldn't do stupid things. But when the month or the quarter is closing, and I had negotiations with CEOs until up to, 11:59 p.m. and we got the contract in at 11:59 p.m. on the last day. So if you turn off your notebook at 6-7 o'clock and say, okay, let's call it a day, I tried everything to get in, then actually you're missing a couple of hours. And when you're in an environment like us, you need to compress time as much as possible. So if you don't go those steps, you'll lose. So that's a very important thing. And obviously there's communication skills and da-di-da-di-da. But those kind of traits, they're really an important fundamental element from a attitude perspective.
Understood. Thank you, Oliver. So what are also some guests you would recommend me to have on the show, which I don't know yet, but you know?
Wow, that's a good question. Phew. I would probably have to think about that, and don't have it on top of my mind. Obviously, I think what you have often in podcasts, you have a lot of founders for valid reasons. I don't want to discard that, but I think by now we have also very interesting senior operators.
Yes.
In the startup ecosystem. And I mean, you had a few already on your show, and I would simply recommend try to find more of those gems, because ultimately, they're also doing big parts of that important work. They're not just lucky people who happen to jump on the right rocket ship. They're actually fueling the rocket ship.
Exactly, and not always having the stage primary. So I think there are really, as you said, a lot of hidden gems. So maybe you can, when you think about someone, just ping
I'll
me.
get back to you, definitely. Yeah.
And
I mean, I have a couple of gems in my team, but I'll see who else comes on top of my mind.
Yes. And what are some final words for somebody who also wants to build a sales unit from 500 customers to more than 10,000 customers?
I think it goes back to those traits that I've outlined. So, when you are in this hyper growth VC backed type of game, you have to strike a balance between how do I build it right for scale and how do I operate scrappy enough to get to the next stage. It's a little bit like a computer game. So I don't want to diminish, the seriousness of what people are doing. But on the other side, we're not, saving humanity or something like that. So we're somewhere in between saving humanity and a video game. And a video game typically works like that. So you can think about the end boss as much as you want. If you don't make it through the levels to get to the end boss, you'll never get to the end boss. So that's a very important piece. And you need to constantly balance this because you need to do what's necessary. You need to deliver the results, and you need to be smart around that. So it's hard to make it tangible without, like a concrete example. Let's say your business is exactly here and there. So there's then definitely specific recommendations that you can think of, but it's really the motivation. Why are you doing it? Like, do you have the right drive? Do you have the right intention on this is what you need to do? And like, are you willing to do it? Or do you feel like when you have the first setbacks, why the fuck am I doing this? So it's a mindset thing.
Cool. Thank you.